With such a cross-section of our population here this morning, I thought we could do a little market research. I want to do that, though, in keeping with the spirit of the holiday. Let's only identify the answers in our own hearts, which is clearly why I didn't get a degree in sociology. What was the last time that you had a conversation about what you believe about God? As you think about that, according to your estimations, what percentage of the people in this room do you think believe in God? Now, do you think that this room is indicative of the rest of the Jewish population in North America? What about the population of North America, Jewish or otherwise? Luckily, the Pew Research Center is much better at this than I am, because in their findings, we learned that a full 56% of Americans believe in the God described in the Bible for those who identify as Christian. In the Jewish community, that number is only 26%. That's not to say that Jews don't believe in God, because in fact, 76% identify that they believe in some form of God. It's just that only 26% of them believe in the God as described in the Bible. That actually makes a lot of sense. Because when you look at the biblical narrative, to say that there is one unified description of God throughout the whole text might be a little bit of a misnomer. Let's talk about a few examples. In Genesis 1, at the very beginning of everything, we read, when God began to create the heavens and the earth being unformed and void, with darkness over the surface of the deep, and a wind from God sweeping over the water, God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. We read about a God who exists before anything else except water, apparently, but we don't have time for that. God is beyond anything we can comprehend. And yet only 2 chapters later, we read in Genesis 3, they, Adam and Eve, heard the sound of God moving around in the garden at the breezy time of day. And the man and his wife hid from God among the trees of the garden. Moments ago, we had a God so unreal that we couldn't fathom God's existence even beyond the universe, and now we have a God who likes to go for walks in the afternoon. And also a God against whom we can hide, apparently. In Exodus, it only gets more complicated. We see God described as coming to Moses through a burning bush. We see God described as the mighty Redeemer, making miracles happen well beyond the laws of nature. And of course, we get a description of God showing God's shoulders to Moses, implying that God does in fact have shoulders. We're bouncing around quite a bit in this story. And finally, we get to this, not finally, but finally for our examples, we get to this idea of Exodus 34, where we read this famous verse, Adonai, Adonai, El Rachum V'Chanun, O God, compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, yet not remitting all punishment, but visiting the iniquity of parents upon children and children's children, upon the 3rd and 4th generation. Lots of adjectives, lots of descriptions, all in one small chunk of Torah. And from this verse, we derive the much larger body of work of Musar, the Jewish practice of looking within oneself to try and identify these traits, which we attribute to God and which we try and find within ourselves. Over and over again throughout the Torah and the wider Bible, we see an ever-shifting perception of what God is and what God can be in our lives. The writer, Jack Miles, attempted to track this character development in his book, God, a Biography, which is both intriguing and frenetic, because God's character changes not only in the classic sense of a character arc, which is what Jack Miles tries to describe, but also from one chapter to the next, and even within some chapters. Sometimes we take that to mean that God has to be all of these things. We do, after all, like to talk about God as omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. But if we want to get any value out of our relationship with God, we have to be understanding that this too wide definition makes it especially hard for us to feel any kind of meaningful connection. It almost seems as though God is struggling with the very common notion of if you try to be everything to everyone, sometimes you wind up being nothing to anyone. Yet in many Jewish spaces, we seem not to talk about what we believe all that much. In the Orthodox community, it somewhat makes sense that conversations about what do you believe about God aren't as prevalent. We read what we understand, and so there you go. But in progressive Judaism, there are so many ways God can fit into our lives, yet we shirk the responsibility of having open, honest, and sometimes uncomfortable conversations about what it is we believe, what we don't believe, and what we need from God in order that we might feel that sense of connection. While I'm asking you to think about your relationship with God, I also want you to ask about how you interact with this space, the Valley Temple. What percentage of the time that you spend on the premises do you spend in this room, the sanctuary? What percentage of the time that you spend with us happens in worship and prayer? Sure, there are lots of reasons to be here, from religious school and meetings and events and meals and meals and meals. But the most common reason most people show up is for us to engage in worship. What does it mean then that we spend the most time in a space where we do the least conversation? Because at the end of the day, so much of what we articulate when we pray is directed at God. How can we bring our best selves to prayer without first doing the work of figuring out who, what, and how we are praying to? The hesitancy to discuss bold piety actually makes a lot of sense, especially when juxtaposed with today's Torah portion. Because during the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, we see religious zeal taken too far. We see Abraham gleefully go about the process of showing his faith, demonstrating his passion for God by taking Isaac up the mountain in order to sacrifice him. There are lots of ways that we can make ourselves feel better. We can say that Abraham never really meant to do this and was going along with the test but had faith that God would save the day in the end. We also have the idea that God was just testing Abraham, and this isn't actually the God that we have, but at the end of the day, it is not unreasonable for our people of faith in this congregation to look out and say, oof, I'm not sure I want a relationship with a God that would ask that of me. So why is it that we are so rarely exploring the intricacies of what God is in our lives? In many ways, Judaism doesn't actually require that much attention to God, as surprising as that might be. It is not only possible to be an enthusiastic, authentically engaged Jew without a relationship with God, but sometimes it actually feels easier not to burden ourselves with these lofty conversations. Judaism can provide us a community of support, can offer us ritual practices to mark times and seasons and transitions in our lives, and can be a centering ideology for social justice work. All of this can be done without God. The problem is each of these things can also be done without Judaism, although I would agree, not nearly as impactfully. As Jews continue to expand our presence in secular society, we are finding more and more ways to meet our needs in a la carte fashion. We make friends in our neighborhood, we build communities at school and at work, we get to play in soccer leagues and mahjong tournaments and experience the pull of social justice in online forums and marches. So why is it worth it to invest in a Judaism that requires a level of spiritual work that for many is more comfortable to be left on the sidelines? One of the recent developments in counter-reaction to this is that the secular world has started to see a rise in self-care influencers on social media. In many ways, these are people who are offering a gospel of self-love. In a world where we are constantly told we are lacking, it makes beautiful, profound sense that there are corners of the internet trying to improve our perception of our identities. But what happens when we conflate that message of love with the harsh reality of our world? What do we do when we are confronted by the complexity of life and only have that one arrow in our quiver? In May of 2021, Lee Stein wrote a New York Times article titled "The Empty Religions of Instagram." Stein explores the way that social media influencers have started to occupy many of the pastoral care roles once practiced by clergies in other areas. In many ways, this is laudable behavior. So many find organized religion to be full of barriers to entry, making it difficult to find the benefits under the thick layers of obligation. But when we curate only the easiest form of spiritual pleasantness, we wind up alienating some of the best ways that organized religion can operate and can uplift us. Which is what led Stein to conclude her article, "There is a chasm between the vast scope of our needs and what influencers can provide. We're looking for guidance in the wrong places. Instead of helping us to engage with our most important questions, our screens might be distracting us from them. Maybe we actually need to go to something like church." A novel idea. Contrary to what you might have seen on Instagram, our purpose is not to optimize our one wild and precious life. It's time to search for meaning beyond the electric church that keeps us addicted to our phones and alienated from our closest kin. As Stein so clearly articulates, we can make ourselves feel good when we stay in the safe zone of pleasant self-love. But what happens when the world around us, say, gives us a global pandemic or ideological upheaval? When we cherry pick only that which makes us feel good, we don't have the tools we need to actually confront complexities of life that can serve us most helpfully in the diversity of experiences we are likely to face. Judaism offers us a tapestry of emotions that help us to understand all of what we might face, not just the things that make us feel most safe and cozy. Of course, Judaism does love self-love. Judaism offers all of the beauty that we're getting on Instagram, but it also offers so much more. The great irony of me using this example is that one of the influencers that Stein uses in her article is a woman named Glennon Doyle. Doyle is a writer and a public speaker who explores many different avenues of meaning-making. Her book, Untamed, is not only an international bestseller, but also a truly insightful exploration of cultivating religious traditions to create personal faith. What makes it ironic is that this self-declared Christian actually articulates a spiritual concept that is one of the central ways that I understand God in my own beliefs. In her book, she describes each of us as a bucket of sea, yearning to return to the larger body of water. We feel called by all the other buckets around us, each of the individuals who themselves represent this holy, blessed water, and in some ways yearn to return to the larger whole. You are a bucket of sea, she says. That's why you feel so big and so small. It's pretty incredible that a non-Jew could help a rabbi better understand my own relationship with God. But in fact, that's exactly what Judaism tries to teach us. Because as we explored earlier, our Bible contains all kinds of conceptions of God. Not to offend Mr. Miles, but we're not supposed to read the Bible as a biography of God, or an autobiography, depending on who you ask. The Bible is meant to be a tool that shows us how our ancestors encountered the divine in their own lives, and we are invited to try on different expressions of faith to figure out what resonates best with us. There are a lot of people who think that the obligation of faith in Judaism is to believe in a God like this. If this is not how you understand God, that is okay. If you need rabbinic permission to break free of the patriarchal, simplistic view of God, you have it right here, signed, sealed, and delivered. Not only are we allowed to look around and find the expressions of faith that most resonate with us, but our Judaism tells us that it is the best way to accomplish this partnership with God. Of course, we aren't without precedent. In Exodus, we read about Yitro, Moses' father-in-law, who helps the leader of our people to understand the best ways to adjudicate the law and sit before the people. Right there, we have a priest of another faith tradition giving our leaders instructions about how to best manage our sacred obligation. If that wasn't enough to validate what Yitro does for our people, the Ten Commandments are actually contained in the Torah portion that bears Yitro's name. Such an incredible honor that it lifts up this incredible relationship, not only between Yitro and his son-in-law, but also between us and those who encounter God in any number of ways. We are encouraged to accept wisdom wherever it comes, as long as we bring it back within the confines of our own peoplehood that has kept us and preserved us throughout the generations. We need to change the question we ask when we approach our faith. To borrow, paraphrase, and mess with John F. Kennedy's quote, we should ask not what we can do for Judaism, but rather what Judaism can do for us. This isn't meant to be transactional. Rather, it is more important to our sense of identity that we find a Judaism that fits our spiritual and emotional needs, rather than to preserve a monolithic tradition that was never all that unified in the first place. When we work so hard to protect Judaism that there's no space for Jews anymore, we've lost our sense of purpose. One of my all-time favorite Jewish quotes comes from the book of Psalms, chapter 18, when we read, Zeh hayom asa Adonai, this is the day that the Eternal has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. On its surface, this seems to be a declaration that God creates wonderful things and we should be happy about that. But there's also another meaning. We're not actually told anything about the day that God made. We're not told it's a great day. We're not told it's a bad day. It's just a day. We're told to rejoice in that day because of our reaction to it. The psalm articulates that all days are created by God, the good and the bad, the beautiful and the devastating. Our opportunity is to find joy, to find purpose, and to find comfort in that we are not alone in trying to find meaning. Because we will be able to rejoice when we know that we have found something worth celebrating, that we aren't lost and alone in the world, and that we are walking in the path of intention with others at our side, each attempting to understand the meaning of life together. The famous scientist Carl Sagan once wrote, "How is it that hardly any major religion has looked at science and concluded, this is better than we thought? The universe is much bigger than our prophets said, grander, more subtle, more elegant. Instead, they say, no, 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 my God is a little God, and I want him to stay that way." A religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by the conventional faiths. What a beautiful idea. This notion that religion can be centralized to the beauty that we encounter in the world around us, that we can accept that the world has so many amazing things we can learn about, and that every step that we learn, we grow closer to understanding not only the world, but also God and ourselves. If only we had a faith that allowed this kind of celebration of joyous scientific belief. Oh, wait, we do. Because that reading is found on page 5 of the book in your hand. So let's come together and share all of the ways, and you're checking my work. Let's come together and share all of the ways we experience God in all of the majestic, the complex, and yes, sometimes the unsettling ways to feel faith. And let us to continue to wrestle, to be Am Yisrael, the people who struggle with God, in order that we can place God in meaningful ways in our own lives together. L'Shana Tova.